Good morning, everyone. I wanted to thank you for attending today's webinar. It is just a minute after 10 o'clock. There are still people joining, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with just a couple announcements and housekeeping items. Because of the number of people that are joining the webinar today, everyone is going to be on mute. If you do have questions that you would like to ask us during the session, you can type them into the questions box on the GoToMeeting bar, and we do have someone monitoring the questions, and we'll try to respond to you during the session. If you're unable to respond during the session, or it's better to follow up individually, we will reach out to you directly afterwards. Again, just a couple things. We will send out a copy of the presentation to the registrants. That should come out probably within the next few days. So you will have a copy of the slides and you can access the recording as well. Again, don't hesitate to ask questions. Again, type them into the questions bar. If we're unable to respond during the session, we will follow up afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and get started so that we can finish on time. I do try to leave some time for questions at the end that I'll try to respond to if I'm able. Otherwise, again, we'll follow up with you. So just to introduce myself, my name is Kaylee Ferraro. I am the manager of Affirmative Action Services at CAI. Have been here for over 7 years now and have been doing affirmative action for longer than that as well. All right, get my slides to advance. So just a little bit of information about CAI if you are unfamiliar. We are an employers association here in North Carolina with over 1,200 members. We have been around for over 50 years, and we focus specifically on HR, compliance, and people development. And we are a local resource again, focused mainly in North Carolina, but certainly things such as affirmative action carry over into other states as well. And again, specifically, my area is the Affirmative Action Division, and we do assist organizations with preparing written affirmative action programs. We can assist with audits or compliance training, as well as just general support about affirmative action. All right, so what we're going to cover today is specifically just kind of high level about affirmative action, what the regulations require, who's covered, how do you, what has to be developed in a plan, as well as just some additional requirements for affirmative action, various things, what has changed recently, what should we expect going forward with affirmative action. And again, we'll try to certainly answer any questions as they come in, or at least at the end, or again, we'll follow up with you. So if we actually get into specifically affirmative action programs, I kind of like to start with what is the definition of affirmative action? What does it mean? What is its purpose? It is intended to promote opportunities for those groups who have been historically disadvantaged. It is based on the principles of equal opportunity laws, and what the intention is to kind of level the playing field, to remove barriers from the workforce, and as well as eliminate discrimination, again, for those groups who have been historically disadvantaged. Equally important, I think, is what is affirmative action not? It does not mean quotas. It does not mean set-asides or preferential treatment. It does not mean you have to select people who are unqualified. So again, it is intended to level the playing field, to be inclusive of all different types of workers. So let's talk about the regulations, what are the requirements of affirmative action. There are 3 different regulations that govern affirmative action. They are Executive Order 11246, Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, as well as Section 4212 of the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, which I'll refer to as VEVRA going forward. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about these regulations. Executive Order 11246 was signed by President Johnson in 1965, so these requirements have been around for a while, and it prohibits federal contractors and subcontractors from discriminating in any employment decisions on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, or national origin. And gender identity and sexual orientation are newly added. They were added as protected groups in 2015. So those were not part of the original executive order, but they are protected classes now. And this regulation does require federal contractors to engage in affirmative action specifically for women and minorities. The second regulation is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it also prohibits discrimination, this time on the basis of disability status. Again, requires federal contractors to take affirmative action in all employment activities focused on individuals with disabilities. And it does require employers to make reasonable accommodations for those qualified individuals with disabilities. And that can be in any employment situation. So during the hiring process, promotions, any type of selection, you do have to consider making a reasonable accommodation. And then lastly, the third regulation is the VEVA regulation, which again prohibits discrimination and requires federal contractors to engage in affirmative action in employment decisions, this time on the basis of protected veteran classification. All right, so who does this affect? Who's covered by these three regulations? This is covered for those organizations that do business with the federal government, and that can be a direct contract, so you are working directly with the federal government. Your contract is with them. It also covers subcontractors, so you may not have a direct contract with the federal government, but you are assisting another organization with their contract with the federal government. The same requirements are required regardless of if you are a first-tier contractor or your third or fifth tier down as a subcontractor. And these are specifically, I'm going to really kind of focus on supply and service organizations. So you are providing goods or services that will help fulfill a federal contract. There are also coverage requirements for if you are construction. Those requirements are a little bit different for the affirmative action for women and minorities. However, the regulations for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans are the same regardless of the type of contract that you have. So again, you're doing business with the federal government, either directly or indirectly. There are some coverage thresholds that require you to be an affirmative action employer. So if your contract is worth at least $10,000 or more, then you are covered by basic coverage of affirmative action. So non-discrimination, taking affirmative steps to employ, again, women, minorities, individuals with disabilities, protected veterans. Although those coverages amounts for veterans and disabilities are slightly different. I'm going to show you a chart in just a second. Financial institutions, or think banks, or are also covered. If you serve as a federal depository for funds in any amount, or that you are covered by FDIC or NCUA deposit insurance. The federal government assumes that you are a contractor if you fit into those qualifications. So again, you as a bank, you may not have a direct contract, but you're covered if, again, you serve as a depository or you're covered by those deposit insurance. All right, so again, some basic requirements as far as thresholds. Basic coverage for affirmative action, $10,000 or more, if your contract is worth that. For women and minorities. For individuals with disabilities, the Section 503 is $15,000 or more, and for the veterans requirement, it's $150,000 or more. To have to develop a written affirmative action program, your federal contracts have to be worth at least $50,000 or more, and you have to have throughout your organization 50 or more employees for women and minorities and individuals with disabilities And then for the veterans requirement for a written affirmative action program, again, that's $150,000 or more and 50 or more employees. So who enforces these requirements? The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP, is a division of the Department of Labor, and they do enforce all three of those regulations. They do select organizations for audit to ensure that you are complying with the requirements. They can investigate charges of discrimination, and ultimately can collect financial damages. This slide says specifically for non-compliance, but the financial damages are for making people whole. So if you have, discriminated against a protected group, you would need to correct that, and that would be in terms of financial damages. The OFCCP is currently led by an interim acting director, Thomas Dodd. He has been in place since the former director left shortly after the election. So this this division of DOL is, kind of in flux right now as we wait for an actual full-time director to be announced. So we'll kind of see what happens with this group as things kind of settle down, as a new director comes in play. Again, not sure when that's going to happen, but we'll kind of assume that the OFCCP will proceed as they have until they get a director installed and kind of get people trained and in place as far as how they're going to focus going forward. So let's kind of get into the requirements of the affirmative action program. So let's assume that your organization does have to develop a written affirmative action program. Those programs have to be in place for each location that you have that has 50 or more employees. Each separate facility that you have that meets that 50 or more employees has to have a separate program developed. For those locations that you have that are smaller than 50 employees, or if you have remote employees, they do have to be part of an affirmative action program. You can develop a separate program for a small location, again under 50 employees, or you can incorporate them into a different affirmative action program, such as one where their HR function responsibility lies, or the location who has management responsibility for that location. There are slightly different requirements for women and minorities, and then individuals with disabilities and protected veterans. All three of those kind of programs, I'm going to kind of break them into three programs: one for women and minorities, one for individuals with disabilities, and one for protected veterans. All three of them have a narrative or verbiage component that you have to incorporate into your program. Women and minority, there are some specific statistical or numeric reports that you have to run and include on an annual basis. And then for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans, there are some data collection and numeric thresholds that you have to incorporate, as well as some assessments that have to be included on an annual basis. So I just was talking about, an annual basis. These programs do have to be developed yearly for as long as you are covered under the requirements. So as long as you are working on a federal contract or subcontract, you do have to annually update your programs. The plan date when you do that affirmative action plan is really left to your discretion when you want to do your plan development. I know a lot of organizations run on a calendar year program because that kind of just works for them, but you are not required to do so. You can certainly do so on your company's fiscal year or some other time frame throughout the year, but each year on that annual cycle, you would need to again update or re-prepare your affirmative action program. If you are a new federal contractor, the requirements are that you have a plan in place within 120 days of your contract commencement. So if you sign up brand new as a federal contractor, your contract becomes effective January 1, 2018. Within the first 4 months of the year, you should get your affirmative action program in place. So your affirmative action program really kind of covers kind of a 2-year program. Your affirmative action program in general is a look forward document. So as we're coming up on 2018, if you are running a calendar year plan, your affirmative action program would be effective from January 1, 2018 through the end of 2018, so December 31, 2018. So it is addressing what you're going to do for the upcoming year. If there are areas you're going to focus on, this is what you're going to do. It's a look forward preparation. There is also a component that you have to look back at the prior 12 months, specifically looking at employment activities. So think your hires, your promotions, terminations, applicants, and that's for the 12 months leading up to your plan. So again, as you are preparing your 2018 calendar year plan, looking forward, what are you going to do going forward, as well as looking back what happened in 2017. Who were your hires? Who were your applicants? So just to kind of identify what has to be incorporated into that narrative or that verbiage component of your affirmative action program, you do have to show commitment to equal employment opportunity. You have to identify which parties internally are responsible for the implementation. Think an EEO coordinator, or beyond that, who has ultimate responsibility. Could be your VP of HR, as well as support from your president and CEO. You are required to identify if there are problem areas and any action-oriented programs you are going to develop to correct any of those problem areas that you identified. And then you do also have to include information on internal auditing and reporting. What are you doing to focus internally on items such as reviewing your employment practices, looking at your compensation. If there are goals that you're working forward to, what are you doing within those? And then the statistical reports, specifically looking at women and minorities, there are required reports that have to be prepared on an annual basis. These are prepared based on employees as of a point in time. So if we're talking about a calendar year affirmative action program, we're going to develop a program for 2018, we're going to look at who your employees are leading up to that time frame. Typically that is just prior to your plan date. So who are your employees as of 12/31/2017? What job are they in? What is their race, gender? What is their compensation? What was their hire date? We're going to need information on employees as of that point in time. And then we will develop specific reports that are identified here: your workforce analysis, job group analysis, availability, comparing your incumbents to availability, placement goals, if there are any, again, focusing on women and minorities. And then if you had goals in the prior year, how did you do towards attaining those? I'm not going to get into details about all of these reports just to kind of keep us on track, but if you are unfamiliar with these specific reports or need assistance identifying any questions that you have, certainly reach out to us. Again, so this is information that has to be incorporated into your Women and Minorities Affirmative Action Program. I had mentioned that there is also kind of that look back component, what happened in the prior 12 months, specifically looking at employment activities, and I'm going to look at here, your hires, your promotions, your terminations. So you should review your employment activities. Looking back, the requirement is you have to do so at least annually. You can certainly do so more often if you would like to take a look at what has happened, in each quarter or some other time frame. You can certainly do so, but you have to, at least on an annual basis, look back at those employment selections and do an analysis to ensure that there were no potential areas of discrimination or adverse impact. So the analysis that we prepare, as well as the OFCCP would do if you are selected for an audit, is they're going to take a look at your selections and compare your selections to who was considered. So looking at who you hired compared to who your applicants were, who your promotions were compared to those who were considered, as well as taking a look at terminations, both voluntary and involuntary, grouped together, as well as specifically probably going to focus on involuntary terminations, so where the company made the decision to part ways. So as you take a look at your employment activities, if you do see that there are issues when you're looking at your selection rates, you're selecting males at a higher rate than you are females, you would certainly want to investigate to ensure that you can defend the selections that you made. So we'll kind of talk through some of these in more detail. Your analysis for comparing your hires, and we also include offers because those are decisions your company made to move forward, even though an applicant may have declined those offers. We're going to look at the selection rates, specifically looking at comparing males to females, minorities to non-minorities, as well as the OFCCP also looks at individual classifications. So maybe comparing Asian to females, or excuse me, Asian to Hispanic. So you can have to get in even more detail in comparing specific race groups. But we're going to take a look at the selections, again, made for those different groups and compare them to your applicant pool to ensure that the selections are expected based on who is considered. So if you think about in terms, I'll try to explain it a little more. If your applicant pool is 100 people, of which half were male and half were female, if you make 10 selections from those 100 people considered, in a perfect world, half would be male and half would be female because that mirrors your applicant pool. The adverse impact analysis is really looking to see when those selection rates are not exact, if they fall within an expected range. So if you selected 6 males and 4 females instead of 5 and 5, is that enough that it would flag for outside of an expected rate? Probably not, but if it's 8 males and 2 females when your applicant pool is equal, then that would flag for females not being selected at a rate that was expected based on who is part of your pool. So as we're doing that analysis, it seems pretty simple. Okay, well, I'll take a look at who we hired compared to who our applicants were. But really, who is an applicant? It seems like it would be a pretty simple definition, but it's not. So the OFCCP in 2006 came out with something that is called the Internet Applicant Rule to help companies really kind of shore up, because in the today's current world, it's really easy to apply for jobs. So companies were really forced to look at a lot of different applicants. So this Internet Applicant Rule really kind of helps you take a look and narrow down the scope of kind of job seekers to who really you're considering. So to have to include in your analysis for affirmative action, we can kind of funnel down those people that all applied for positions and really focus on really who is considered. So there are 4 prongs to this Internet Applicant Rule. Certainly someone has to submit an expression of interest using some type of electronic method. They can use your careers page, come into your ATS, you could do a resume search on a database, they can email, however they are expressing their interest, if they're using an electronic method. And you can certainly identify that we only consider people who follow certain criteria. You have to apply through our online system. We don't accept unsolicited resumes or applications. You have to apply for an open position. So you can certainly make that even a little more rigid as far you're not going to just let people email you their resume. Prong 2 is you have to consider them, you as the contractor have to consider them for employment for a specific position. So think, you've opened up a role, you're trying to hire a receptionist. You post the position, within 2 hours you have 200 people that have applied. If you only look at 50 of those 200 people, then your applicants kind of are starting at those 50 people. The other 150 people, you're not including in this analysis because you didn't consider them. If you didn't review their resume, if you're not making a no-go decision on them, then they're kind of knocked out for affirmative action purposes as an applicant. The third prong is that those applicants have to meet the basic qualifications of the job. If your requirements for that receptionist position are, it is a part-time job, the hours are between 8 and 12, you're looking for someone, that has a year of experience, you want a little bit of experience, and that, someone has to be able to work maybe, on the weekends every once in a while. Though if those are your basic qualifications, if someone is unable to meet those basic qualifications, then for affirmative action, we're going to remove them from consideration. That basic qualifications is just that. These are the very minimum qualifications you have to have to be considered for this job. So if someone does not meet your basic qualifications, then they're out. These are not like to have. They are not tests. Those tests can't be used as a basic qualification. And then finally, the last prong is that someone doesn't remove themselves from consideration. So you try to call someone for a phone screen, and they never respond. You try to bring them on site, they don't show up. If at that point in time they're removing themselves from consideration, and for affirmative action purposes, you would pull them out. Otherwise, as long as an applicant meets all 4 of those criteria, we have to include them in the affirmative action analysis for comparing hires to applicants. I will say something that will assist you with identifying who has to be considered for affirmative action analysis is to really pay attention to disposition codes or reasons for your applicants. We see a lot of really kind of basic dispositions: not hired, position filled, overqualified. While those kind of give you an idea, okay, well, we didn't hire someone, it would be better if you knew specifically why you didn't hire them. If they were unable to work the hours that you were requested, or they didn't meet your basic qualifications, their salary requirements were out of range. To really know why someone was not selected, just other than not selected, helps us narrow down who has to be included in those analysis. Again, part of that applicant pool funnel. Because if someone doesn't meet your basic qualifications, we want to take them out of that applicant pool for analysis. If all we have is position filled or not selected, that doesn't really help you to identify those people who you didn't consider. So my recommendation is to try to use really specific dispositions to help you with your analysis. I will say that ideally you want your applicant pool for these analysis to be as small as possible. Not trying to exclude people to just to have small numbers, but you really want to focus on who you were considering. Again, if you didn't review a resume, we don't need them in the analysis. So if there's one thing that you can do going forward is to update or be a little more specific with your dispositions, I would certainly recommend doing that. And certainly, in order to prepare your affirmative action programs on an annual basis, to be able to do this look back, you do have to track your applicant information. I kind of have a basic log here. I mean, certainly this can be done electronically in an ATS, but if you don't have one, or you're just tracking, kind of think old school paper, information that you need to track on your applicants. You need to know what position they're applying for, who's applying, their race, gender, veteran, disability status. You have to offer them the opportunity to self-identify, and again, the reason why they're either moving forward or not moving forward in your process. So just kind of a basic look here. You also have to take a look at your promotions. The good thing about promotions is you get to define what a promotion means to your organization. While it typically is an employment action that results in higher pay or rank or skills and responsibility, again, you can really define what promotions mean to your organization. And promotions can be both competitive and non-competitive. So think that you may have a non-competitive situation where it's more of a career progression. You're rewarding someone for good work and time with the organization. You're going to move them, up from one level to the next level. You may not have considered anyone else for that, but that's still a promotion. And then you are, for the analysis, you should be able to identify who was considered for those promotions. Again, I think there are some that the only person that was considered was that person because of the career progression. But in other terms, there may be competitive promotions where you have an opening in a manager position in your accounting group. You may look to the people within that department for promotion into that management position. And that can be you just look internally, or it could be that you kind of post that position internally and ask people to apply if they are interested in that. But you do need to do an analysis to ensure that your promotions are also not adversely impacting one group or another. And then finally, you should also take a look at your terminations. Terminations include, at least initially, both voluntary and involuntary terminations. And then what we would do for terminations, depending on the type of terminations, if you're having a reduction in force, then you could certainly identify who was considered as part of that RIF. But other terminations, you may just look at who's currently in your organization at the time as your pool of people who could have been considered. Certainly you would want to track the reason that people are terminating, again, whether it's a voluntary, they were retired, or it's an involuntary, they didn't follow your rules or requirements. You'd certainly want to track that information so that you could, if you needed to, focus on, for example, involuntary terminations, those where the company made the separation decision. And then as far as just kind of recruiting requirements, as you are recruiting this, your hiring process is really something that the OFCCP focuses on during audits. So other things that you would want to consider or ensure that you are doing as part of your hiring process, there is a requirement to list your jobs with the state job service. You are making that hiring. So here in North Carolina, you are required to list your jobs with NC Works, which is part of the division. Excuse me. Formerly Employment Security Commission. Your job advertisements, so your advertising open positions, you should include an affirmative action, equal opportunity tagline. We're an equal opportunity employer. You are required to do targeted outreach and recruiting efforts if you have goals for women, and then there are requirements for individuals with disabilities and veterans as well. Again, you have to solicit demographic information of your applicants. You have to provide them the opportunity to identify race and gender, as well as veteran and disability status. Certainly people can opt out, but you have to provide that information so that you have that information to do the analysis. And then certainly you do need to ensure that you are tracking your applicant information. Again, certainly I would recommend paying attention to disposition reasons. And then certainly you have to maintain those records so that if you are audited, you have that information. And there is a general 2-year record-keeping requirement, although the veterans and individuals with disabilities, some of the components are a 3-year record-keeping requirement. For women and minorities, you also have to, on an annual basis, do a compensation review. The guidance you get, or the requirement that you get from the OFCCP, is you have to evaluate your compensation systems to determine whether there are gender, race, or ethnicity-based disparities. So there's not a specific required method for doing this compensation review. Typically, you're gonna look at comparing your pay for women to their male counterparts, as well as looking at minorities and non-minorities, or even specific minority or race classifications. So comparing again, Asian to Hispanic, or Black to Native American. So you can have to look at that in that method. And whatever method you choose to do your compensation review, you do have to look where there are disparities in pay and investigate to ensure that you can explain the differences. There's no requirement that you pay everyone the exact same. You may have certain things that would cause someone to be paid more. How long they've been with the organization, if they have a higher level degree than someone else. You just need to be able to kind of defend that and have the records to prove why there are pay differences. I will say in audits, the OFCCP has kind of been all over the place as far as how they're doing their review of compensation. We have certainly seen them focus more on kind of more statistical or improved reviews, so using like a regression analysis or a more specific statistical type test. But as part of your audit, you are required to turn over employee level information that includes compensation. So I would certainly recommend that you do your own review of compensation so that if you are audited, you have already started taking a look where there are differences and done the investigation and can speak to where there are differences. So that's really the requirements for the women and minorities. We're going to kind of go through the requirements for protected veterans and individuals with disabilities. These requirements changed in 2015, and they are pretty similar as far as the requirements for veterans and individuals with disabilities. So I'm going to kind of lump them together when we're talking about the requirements. Again, some slightly different information, but for the most part, they're very similar. The jurisdictional thresholds did change. These also changed in 2015 that kind of upped the amount of coverage. So previously, VEVRA, the requirements for that were 100,000. They're now 150,000, and that includes the VETS 4212 that is filed on an annual basis. And then for individuals with disabilities, that threshold increased from $10,000 to $15,000 for basic coverage, and then again for written affirmative action program for individuals with disabilities, that's 50,000 and 50 or more employees, and then for veterans 150,000, again that coverage chart here, and 50 or more employees. So just in case you're not sure who's a covered veteran, there are 4 different groups that are protected veterans: disabled veterans, recently separated veterans. So if you've had a separation from a military branch and that is within the last 36 months, active duty wartime or campaign badge veterans, and then those veterans who have earned an Armed Forces Service Medal veterans. So those are the 4 groups that are covered under these affirmative action requirements. So not all veterans are covered, just those 4 groups. And then as far as who's an individual with disability, this definition meets the ADAAA update, but it is anyone that has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or that person has a record of an impairment or is regarded as having an impairment. So just to make sure everyone knows who's included in these definitions. For the written affirmative action programs, the requirements are, again, there is the narrative component, that verbiage that you have to to develop on an annual basis. And then there are some utilization goals or hiring benchmarks, as well as some assessments, and those requirements were changed. That's what changed in 2015, is to kind of really look at that numeric information. The plans for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans do need to be available should an employer applicant ask to see them. Now that is absent that numeric component, but think your narrative information for those programs, again, do need to be made available should an employer applicant ask to see them. Your women and minorities programs do not have to be divulged. Included in the narrative, again, I'm just going to kind of list the requirements. If you need more detail about what each of these groups cover, I can certainly talk to that if you want to reach out to me directly. But you do need to identify your policy statement, your affirmative action equal employment opportunity policy statement, how you disseminate that policy, who's responsible for the implementation of your programs. You need to include information on review of your personnel processes and training for those people who are involved in employment decisions. Again, you need to identify reasonable accommodations, how you're going to handle that. Again, harassment prevention, taking a look at internal auditing and reporting systems, as well as reviewing your physical and mental job qualifications. So that's all part of that narrative section. For the more numeric or data collection components, for individuals with disabilities, you do have to adopt a utilization goal. Those goals have to be done for each job group within your affirmative action program. Unless your company as a whole has fewer than 100 employees at that point in time, you can adopt just that utilization goal for the company as a whole. For veterans, there is a hiring benchmark that you have to adopt on an annual basis, and that is done at each AAP location. So not per job group, but by affirmative action location. And then you do have to collect data on your applicants, hires, and job information, and incorporate that into your programs on an annual basis. And then there is a requirement for you to do assessments on targeted outreach and recruiting. So I'm going to kind of go through some of these just to ensure that everyone is familiar with what you have to do to ensure that you have this data collection and assessment portion. Again, I had mentioned previously in the women and minorities that for job advertisements you do have to incorporate kind of an affirmative action tagline. The veterans and individuals with disabilities requirements, when those regulations changed in 2015, the requirement to spell out veterans and individuals with disabilities instead of using abbreviations occurred. So you can't just use those previous abbreviations, EOE, MF, DV. You have to make sure you're spelling out veterans and disabled in that tagline. Or you can certainly, have a more descriptive statement, such as our company is an equal opportunity employer, all qualified, persons are considered regardless of race, gender, religion, national origin, gender identity, and such. So you can certainly have a more comprehensive statement, but at a minimum, you have to have that kind of basic tagline. Again, you have to provide the opportunity for applicants to self-identify, again, both race and gender, as well as for veterans and individuals with disabilities. So again, prior to the regulation changes in 2015, most companies didn't ask for disability or veteran status of their applicants. That was something they did post-offer, but those requirements are you have to provide that opportunity twice, both pre-offer and post-offer. For the solicitation for disability status, there is a specific OFCCP form that is an OMB approved form, and you have to use that that specific form. It can be unaltered. Now you can pull that, into an ATS and use it electronically, but you have to use that exact language and incorporate that. And then for those individuals with disabilities, you have to ensure that you have surveyed your workforce, and you have to do so every 5 years, and provide a reminder within that 5-year period to your employees that they can certainly change their status at any time. Again, you have to provide an accommodation for individuals with disabilities. You just have to enter into an interactive discussion or process with your employees or applicants. What are they asking? What do they need? What can you offer? I would consider, making sure you're tracking any requests that are made and the result, as well as maybe a kind of a written process or procedure, so that everyone internally that is responsible for this, has some guidance to do so. And then I recommend, if you are, requiring applicants to apply online, to ensure that online system is accessible. So, is it compatible with assistive devices, or is there a process that if someone is unable to do so, apply online because of a disability, is there some process that you have internally that is an exception to that? I had mentioned that you have to adopt utilization goals, again, for individuals with disabilities. That is at the job group level for each affirmative action program. That is a 7% utilization goal. So you would like 7% of each job group to have individuals with disabilities at that percentage rate. For veterans, again, on an annual basis, you have to adopt a hiring benchmark. Currently, that benchmark is 6.7%. That rate is reviewed annually and updated. I think this past year, the updated numbers came out around April. So currently it's 6.7%. Can certainly see that maybe dropping because of the current rate of veteran employment. For the upcoming year. And then you certainly have to conduct a review of, what your utilization looks like for individuals with disabilities, compare it to that 7%, as well as take a look at those hiring benchmarks that you established and how you did towards meeting those benchmarks, and then see if there are areas in which there are issues that you could correct. And then as far as just kind of the data collection, you are required to track the number of applicants, your total applicants, and those are who meet the definition of that internet applicant, and then those that I've identified as protected veteran or individuals with disability. You have to ensure you're capturing the number of people you're hiring that have identified as individuals with disabilities and veterans, as well as total, and then the total number of jobs opened and filled within the year. For the affirmative action programs, you have to capture and report on 3 years worth of this information. So this is a rolling 3-year period. So at the end of 2017, later this month, in my sample here, I would have the numbers for 2017 as well. So again, as this is, became a requirement in 2015, so there are certainly some contractors that are going to have a full 3 years of this information, depending on their AAP date, and then that, again, it'll be a rolling 3-year period to report on. And then you are also required to undertake targeted outreach and recruitment efforts for individuals with disabilities and protected veterans, and then you need to take a look at what you did and whether or not those targeted sources were effective. So I've kind of provided some examples of how you would go through this process, but you're going to look at what you've done, what specific outreach item or recruitment effort that you made for the year, what happened, and then evaluate whether or not that was effective or not. And for the evaluation process, you do have to and I have this listed here, but identify or take a look at whether that activity attracted qualified applicants that were veteran or disabled. Did the activity result in the hiring of individuals with disabilities or veterans? And then did it expand your company's outreach to those targeted groups? And I provided, again, samples for both veterans and individuals with disabilities. And then I had mentioned that there were requirements for a 3-year record-keeping requirement for certain things, specifically outreach and recruitment efforts, that data collection and assessments, self-identification, and then anything that would impact your hiring benchmarks for veterans. So those are all subject to the 3-year record-keeping requirement. Other affirmative action record keeping is only 2 years. To make it easy, it's probably best just to keep everything for 3 years instead of trying to figure out which one is a 2-year record keeping versus a 3-year requirement. So again, probably best just to go with 3 years. If you would like to see some sample affirmative action programs, you're new to this, you're not sure how to prepare your first plan, the OCCP does have some sample plans out there. I included the link if you're interested in that, but they do address, have certainly incorporated the changes for veterans and individuals with disabilities for those transitional plans. And then some of the other requirements as a federal contractor, subcontractor, you do have to file your EEO-1 reports, Vets 4212 reports, again, if you meet those thresholds. There are certain poster requirements. Again, I've talked about the job listing requirements, and then there were some changes to the sexual discrimination guidelines. So I'll kind of go through some of these quickly. We're getting closer to the end of the hour, but I do want to quickly go through these. The EEO-1 report is an annual report that's used to collect race, gender, and ethnicity within job categories of your workforce. Again, this is submitted annually. All private companies that have 100 or more employees have to file this, as well as federal contractors that have 50 or more employees. Your request your employees to self-identify their race and gender so that you can include them in the appropriate classification. There were changes for this report. The revised EEO-1 report was approved for, I'll say 2017, but the changes were the filing period changed from September 30th to March 31. So you will have to file this EEO-1 report by March 31 of 2018. So you didn't have to file anything for 2017. But this revision was a collaboration between EEOC and OFCCP. The requirement was going to be that you had to submit W-2 earning information by certain pay bands within your EEO job categories. That component is postponed indefinitely. So the revised EEO-1 report is really the exact same EEO report that you have filed previously. It's just the date changed, at least for now. So again, the filing period will close March 31, 2018. It's going to be the employees that you're going to include are going to be based on a payroll period that occurs in the 4th quarter of this year. So between October 1 and December 31 of this year are the employees that you'll use to file your report by March 2018. The veterans requirement also has an annual report that you have to file. That report is due September 30th. So hopefully everyone did file that. They actually extended the deadline until November this year because of the hurricanes that happened. But that is a report that is somewhat similar to the EEO-1 report. You're just going to report on veteran information instead of race and gender, again, by those EEO-1 job categories. That report does require you also to report on veteran hiring and total hiring information for the 12 months leading up to that payroll period that you selected. Again, there are certain affirmative action poster requirements or posting requirements. You have to include the equal opportunity is the law poster. There's also a supplemental poster for federal contractors that kind of updates that EEO is the law poster for those changes, such as adding gender identity and sexual orientation as protected groups, as well as changes to the veterans and individuals with disability components. That big poster hasn't been updated yet. I've listed the other main poster requirements. If you are unsure of what these mean, certainly let me know. I can provide that information to you. And then again, there is a requirement to list your jobs. This is with the state job service where you are filling those positions. This is a requirement under the Jobs for Veterans Act. So again, this is a requirement if you have federal contracts of $150,000 or more. There are 3 exceptions to this requirement. So if you are recruiting externally, you do have to list your jobs. Again, here in North Carolina, that's with the NC Works site. Again, there are 3 exceptions to having to list your jobs. If you are only looking internally, so you're not looking externally at all, you don't have to list your jobs. If the position is for a senior or executive management position, you don't have to list the job. And then if it is very temporary in nature, 3 days or less, you don't have to list that. Otherwise, all job openings have to be listed with the appropriate state service. Again, that's a requirement for the veterans. I would certainly identify some other outreach or recruiting sources beyond that for your outreach and recruiting requirement. So what has changed recently? The good news is not a lot has changed really recently. There are some minimum wage increases that are updated annually for certain types of contracts. So if you are a construction contractor covered by Davis-Bacon, if you're Service Contract Acts or concessions not covered by the SCA, then you have certain minimum wage requirements. So for 2017, that was a $10.20 minimum wage. For 2018, that threshold jumps to $10.35. Again, this only certain types of contracts, so not all federal contractors are covered by this. There was a paid sick leave requirement. This covered the same contracts as the minimum wage. So again, Davis-Bacon, Service Contract Act, concessions that required contractors to provide sick leave up to 7 days annually. That became effective in 2017. There was a change for pay transparency that required federal contractors or prohibited contractors from retaliating or discouraging employees or applicants from discussing pay. That became effective in 2016, January, and it required a specific policy statement be posted as well as included in your handbook. And I have that here. And again, I've already talked about the protected classes of gender identity and sexual orientation. Those, again, became effective in 2015. So really, there hasn't been a lot of changes in the last year or so. These are a couple years old, but there were some things that were in the works that became postponed or revoked indefinitely. So there was going to be a requirement to include certain things on your pay stubs, as well as self-reporting of violations for labor laws. Again, that was revoked earlier this year by President Trump, and there was going to be that overtime rule that increased the thresholds for exempt employees. Again, that was kind of put on hold. However, earlier this year, the DOL did publish a request for information, so this is probably not dead in the water. There will probably be some type of changes to the overtime exempt requirements, but we just don't know what those are currently. And then for those of you who are construction contractors, your requirements haven't changed. They've been around for a long time. They've been updated since 1980. The OFCCP keeps saying they're going to update the requirements, and then they keep postponing that. So as of right now, everything is on hold. So what you have been doing is unchanged at this point in time. So. And then quickly, as far as just to kind of talk about the audit process, the OFCCP is kind of currently in flux with the new administration changes. They don't have a permanent director at this point in time, so it's just kind of business as usual. But they have certainly been conducting very thorough audits. They're just good faith efforts are no longer enough. You have to be able to prove some measurable results, and they have certainly focused during audits on requirements for individuals with disabilities, protected veteran, and pay. Pay has been a big focus recently, and we certainly expect that to remain the focus going forward. How the OFCCP responds during audits may change over time, but for now they're going to do what they've been doing, and we're going to expect that to slightly change as the administration gets everyone up to date. So. And we are currently, really at the end. Sorry I did not get to answer any questions, but any questions that you did submit, we will reach back out to you if we have not already done so. And then if you need to reach out to me directly, you can certainly call or email me. I have my contact information, and we will provide a copy of the slides and the recording later on in the next several days. So thank you for your time today, and I will let everyone drop off so that you can get back to your day. I hope you have a good day, and we look forward to hearing from you in the upcoming year. Thanks a lot.